We hope you very much enjoy the next 2 hours. And I'd like to start by introducing our first artistic contribution from Kirsty Law. Now, Kirsty's a Scottish singer and songwriter who draws on traditional Scots music. And this particular song is called The Faithful Shepherdess. And it's based on a poem that was written in 1897 by Thomas Murray, a shepherd in Dumfries and Galloway, who met a young woman who'd just recently become a shepherd. And the song celebrates the departure from assumed gender roles, in this case in farm work. So over to you. Thank you.
Hail Peggy, as I have to sing you, not in when days were fair and sunny, but when they were both wet and wonny, and morns whilst hoary rain and sleet showers swirling round you by cairn and cotty, while other maids in bed were sleeping, or some folk canny cobweb sweeping, maybe some fretting, they've no weeping because of work. You toiled wi' your mantle drenched and dreeping, blithe as a lark, and wi' your doggy at your heel, fu pluckily the braes you spiel, and scan the loops and hollows wheel with quiet care, thy daddy need na dutiful feel, whilst thou art there. And as you scoured back hiding how, and carefully looked round Oak now, and for elk lamb and ilka you had done your best, you happily enjoyed, I trow, a wee-learned rest. Without repining, for that does aft result in whining, when straight to duty's path inclining, truce to nonsense and cordial for ordaining to health and conscience, and happily as the case may be, while if you step out bog or lead, some laddie may be watching thee, no blind nor stupid, and some day hail and own that he was fired by Cupid. Stray among the lambs and ewes, I trust Dame Fortune may they use like raves of Pora. You'll excuse the roosted muse of all Tammany.
Brilliant. Well, I think that's set us up perfectly in terms of a revisiting of the new rural economy. It's a great take on an old theme, and that's what we're hopefully going to come up with today. In a moment, I'm going to introduce you to our main speaker. But first of all, I'm going to try and introduce our first poll to engage you, the audience. And that's because in these particular types of meetings, it's often a little bit hard to remember that it's not just you sitting in front of the screen. And so we felt it would be really useful for us and perhaps interesting for you to know where you're all joining from this afternoon. So if you could, can you all please fill in this, tick one of these boxes, which is the 8th Scottish Government's classification of urban rural Scotland. And then I'll ask the back room if you could give us the results, please, after our main speaker's contribution. Thank you. So it's now up to me to introduce our main speaker, and I'm delighted to introduce Magnus Davison this afternoon. Magnus is a research associate with the University of Highlands and Islands, and he's based in the Environmental Research Institute at Thurso. His research interests and his expertise span a really wide range of areas, and he's thus perfectly placed to start this conversation. So over to you, Magnus.
Perfect. Many thanks for that introduction, Deb, and many thanks to Kirsty for that fantastic artistic contribution. I'm coming from a very remote town here in the north of Scotland, Thurso on the north coast. You'll be able to tell from the following conversation that this is a personal story of mine and my own take on a new rural economy. So whilst I draw inspiration from the many organisations I'm involved with, these views are very much my own and should be taken as such. This conversation is going to settle on 3 main talking points: reindustrialisation, rewilding and repeopling, all appropriate to rural Scotland. However, most of my talk will largely focus on the Highland economy. I'll also propose 3 recommendations of each of these 3 points. So like many other young people, I left the Highlands to go south to study, but unlike a lot of other Highland young folk, I actually came back and returned home. So home, or where I grew up, was the little town of Cromarty on the Black Isle, and is where we'll start our conversation today on a new rural economy. So I'll ask for the first image to be brought up, please. So you may not know the landscape of the Cromarty Firth, but you've probably seen an image like this before. It usually accompanies any BBC story on the price of oil or the oil industry. I'm here seeing that people are struggling to hear, so I'll speak a bit closer. You'll recognise this landscape as being an incredible landscape, Ben with us in the background with these jackups and oil rigs. What you might start to see over the last couple of years is not just these oil rigs and not just these jackups, but we're starting to see a lot more offshore wind farms, tidal turbines, and new renewables coming into the Firth to replace or to accompany these oil rigs. We're seeing white towers of offshore wind farms, wind turbines, yellow substructures of tidal turbines. And this is really telling the story of Highland as an industrial place, not just this landscape of hills and mountains, but industry here in the Highlands. Highland region is actually Scotland's renewable powerhouse. We produce over 1/4 of Scotland's renewable electricity, well more than any other local authority area. We produce over 400% of our own electricity demand. Some people suggest this is a reason to stop building energy infrastructure in the region, but there's an insatiable appetite for renewable electricity in the south. We're hoping to get that down. However, we still do need to produce electricity to send south. So energy is going to be a fundamental building block of this new rural economy, but hopefully not on the current model. The jackets that we see in the Cromarty Firth are built almost anywhere but here, whether that's Newcastle, Belgium, Denmark, the Far East. We have jackets being installed off the Scottish coast, kind of in sight of wind farms, in sight of empty yards, BIFAB, for example. But things here in Cromarty Firth can be an example for the future. Things are looking better. We have a £100 million steel plant, advanced manufacturing in pipeline. We have the idea of a new hydrogen hub, producing green hydrogen from our abundant offshore energy resource, exporting or using in industry here. So it's the most fantastic landscape to kind of combat this idea of wild highlands, industrial highlands. but it's also a really good story to talk about how we can succeed in the future. I've alluded to BIFAB already, and BIFAB failed because of a lack of investment, both by private companies and government. The Cromarty Firth has seen over £100 million invested, both by government and private companies over the last 10 years, really setting this up as Scotland's go-to place to build out offshore renewables. In Highland and Highland Waters, we're looking at around 5 gigawatts of installed capacity, or capacity being installed. We're also looking at something like close to 9 gigawatts of capacity being built out over the next 10 years. So the energy system in Scotland is decentralising. We're closing the coal plants, or we've closed our coal plants. We're closing our nuclear plants, or will do. So rural Scotland's future is very much tied up in energy to feed that population centres in Scottish cities and suburbia, as well as the south of England, or south to England, with renewable electricity. But rural Scotland needs to benefit from this better, not just in building out this infrastructure, but not for being penalised for living so close to this resource. Highland residents pay the highest price for electricity in the whole of the UK. We have some of the highest rates of fuel poverty. We need to look at a new system that is better. We can change the system so that people aren't being penalised for living in this energy-rich region. We can also reward industry for being located close to the energy resource, whether that's lower prices of energy or tax breaks, or just promoting the area better. We can look to hydrogen production, advanced manufacturing, data, food production, lots of fantastic ways of increasing industry, sustainable industry close to the energy resource. This can lead to people here in Highland benefiting from the energy resource better. Others will hopefully go into greater detail over the following conversation around these intensive industries or sustainable industries. But we've been doing it for over 100 years here in Highland with aluminium, been using our renewable resource for sustainable industry to provide materials for the rest of the world. So my first recommendation today is to capitalise on the energy-rich resources for the benefit of our rural communities by relocating appropriately sized sustainable industry to the energy resource. The second R I'm going to talk about is rewilding, and I've wrestled with this term for a number of years now because rewilding can leave many people feeling a bit uncomfortable. They feel uncomfortable because a lot of these areas are not wild, or we don't perceive them as being wild. These can be landscapes of clearance, these can be landscapes which historically had people, but because of economic reasons, they've gone elsewhere. So at this point, it's worth saying that my vision for rewilding does not mean a lack of people or fewer people in the landscape. It just means those people in the landscape taking a step back and reducing the management on the landscape. We can reintroduce people, culture, even language back into these landscapes, whilst enhancing the ecological health and biodiversity of the landscape at the same time. So let's address the issue of wildness. Can I get the second image, please? So as you drive north on the road, the Laird Road to Altnahara, you're faced with a landscape kind of like this, or you are faced with this landscape, although this is a little bit further north than I'm hoping to go to. As you come down the hill and you go past the sign that says Mackay Country, you come to a river and a wee bridge at Inchkinloch. On this journey, we'll leave this little single track road, which is also a main road, and we'll walk into Wildland Area 38. This is actually owned by Scotland's largest private landowner, a self-described rewilder. And it's in this place that I will tell my baby daughter, when she's a little bit older, the story of clearance. And I've chosen this place as where I will tell her about clearance because on her maternal side, her great-grandfather, our fifth great-grandfather, was cleared from this place. It's here I will explain that not just people were cleared from this landscape, but nature and environment were cleared from this landscape with the introduction of both sheep and deer. The way of transhumance was removed from this landscape, and we've seen the ravages of herbivory. I'll explain that the replacement of this sheep and deer has removed the trees, degraded the peatland, and we've seen a loss of the wildlife and nature that should really be here. I use this example of my baby daughter because she will be my age in the year 2050, the focus of many nations' carbon neutrality. And I'll explain that there's people here today who still live with this legacy of clearance. Not many people live in this landscape, and a lot more people should live in this landscape. This is not clearance grievance, this is just talking about people and environment. This is an example of rewilding, which isn't my favourite example of rewilding. It's concentrated land ownership further, and it's in the hands of very few people, one man perhaps in this case. And I don't think it's as good for the people as it could be. To take an example, we just have to take a backtrack back up the road, and we can turn left, and we can take a road to the east, and we can find a better example. We can find hope for the future. For there's a clearance township here in some woodland that's currently undergoing the process of looking to be bought out by the community. We're looking at repopulation, new woodland crofts, environmental restoration, rewilding, but under the guidance and ownership of the community. For the people, of the people, both new and old alike. This is the rewilding that I can support. So my second recommendation is for rural people to reclaim rewilding, to make it our own for the many people and not for the few. So to reclaim rewilding. The third R I'm going to talk about is repeopling. We can now take the journey of the sea eagle. We can fly 25 miles due east. We'll fly over the landscape of clearance. We'll fly from Strathnaver to Strathalladale and on to Strathmore. The Strathmore in Caithness, not in Sutherland. What we've flown over has now become known as the Flow Country. 200,000 hectares of blanket bog, undoubtedly the most beautiful place in Scotland, and I would argue the most beautiful place in the world. And we're going to dwell on ownership just one more time here. This is an area owned by the traditional landed gentry and also an environmental NGO. And we have to think, does this landscape of clearance suit them both? Or can we look to a new way of rural economy in this cleared landscape? This is a landscape of blanket bog, of heath, deer forest, conservation country, wild land, walked up grouse moor. This is not the grouse moor that some people believe 1/5 of Scotland looks like, for example at Drummochter. This is actually quite a nice landscape. There's carbon in the peat, there's a few hardy sheep on the moor, and there's perhaps too many deer, but there's no people. Can I ask for the next image, please? Upwards of 800 people used to live in this strath. That number is now close to zero, if not zero. We can walk into this whole area in the space of between 5 or 6 townships, where we can find that 40 people were cleared from the year 1829 onwards. So we can start at there's millstones of Donald Ross, where you can pull down the walls of the mill, but you can't move the millstones. These farmsteads, which I show you in the pictures, these replace the townships, the cleared townships. So where we might see one house now, there were 10, 12, maybe more houses there before. This is a landscape that would be unjust not to repeople. In the time it takes to travel from Waverley to Haymarket on the train, the new residents that were found in these repeopled settlements could find their place of work at a college, a university, a cinema, a swimming pool, a half-dozen bakers, half-dozen lawyers' offices, a BT call centre, or the UK's largest battery factory. A little longer, another 5, 10, 15 minutes, and we can find our way to a decommissioning nuclear power plant, the world's largest tidal stream array, or a dozen wind farms, the operations base for Scotland's largest offshore wind farm. When I talk about repeopling landscapes, people always say to me, yes, but Magnus, what will these people do? And with this example, you can see they could be doing a lot. But this isn't quite good enough for me. I want to see people of the landscape and not in the landscape. I want to see new crofts created, new woodland crofts created, perhaps new carbon crofts, capitalising on the shift to net zero, carbon credits and peatland restoration. Could you imagine men and women working in the offshore wind farms just north of here, working away for 2 weeks, then coming home to their carbon croft, having some rest and recuperation, and restoring peatlands, managing peatlands on their new carbon croft? The COVID pandemic has had this paradigm shift so that we're now working remotely. Why not put a good internet connection into the Flow Country, into these towns, into these villages, into this repeopled landscape, so that people can work remotely? They could work for a London bank, for example. So could we see people working in this landscape, living in this landscape, restoring this landscape? Could we see the reintroduction of lynx to this landscape, the reintroduction of Gaelic to this landscape, the reintroduction of schools to this landscape? My third recommendation is to re-people, to rewild, to re-industrialise, and to put people in control of their future. I'll very quickly end on one last point. My vision of a new rural economy is this. It's mine, however, I paint it. You might agree with all of it, you might agree with some of it, or none of it. That is totally fine. What can you take from it? If you agree with me, then please work with me to deliver it. If you agree with some of it, but not all of it, please work with me to improve it. If you disagree with all of it, paint a better picture. This is a discussion that we need to have, we need to laugh, we need to cry, we need to make up doing it, we need to stand by our morals, and we need to prepare to listen to others. We need to shift our positions a little bit here and a little bit there. The future of land, which means the future of people, very much depends on it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Magnus. That was great. I should tell everybody that all of the speakers this afternoon were asked to be provocative and passionate. And Magnus, you ticked both of those brilliantly. Thank you. I understand from the chat that there was a wee bit of a problem with the poll in terms of not being able to scroll down to all of the options. I am wishing very, very much we'd chosen the 6-fold classification instead of the 8-fold classification. I wonder if it's worth sharing the results back of house, just so that we can have a look to see what came out. Not that it's obviously going to be very scientifically representative. So it looks, well, I guess it is quite interesting. We've got 28% from urban areas. Urban areas in Scotland at least account for just about 71% in the population as a whole. So it looks like we've got an overrepresentation from rural residents, which is what we would expect. So sorry, both urban areas together are 40% as opposed to 71%. And then, some people did manage to scroll down, which is excellent. And based on this, it does look like we've got a higher representation from people not in the defined settlement areas, the small towns. So as I said, because there was some difficulty with that poll, apologies for that, but at least you know you're not sitting there by yourself out there, and there's lots of other people in this conversation. And it also helps frame, I think, the other speakers' responses. So without further ado, I'd like to invite our first respondent to Magnus's talk, who's Dennis. So Dennis Overton is, amongst many, many other things, currently the chairman of the board of Scotland Food and Drink, and he's the co-founder of the Rossshire-based sustainable seafood business Aquascot. So Dennis, I invite you to give your contribution, your response.
Well, thank you, Deb. Much of the talk of the rural economy can be dry, technical, and seem remote to the people who live in rural Scotland. So I have to say I enjoyed Magnus's visionary piece, The Soaring over Sutherland and Caithness. And my response is to move to earth that vision with two practical situations that need thinking about. The first kicked off about 7 years ago when our employee-owned aquaculture business started to experiment with seaweed farming off the north and west coasts. We've had to learn everything from scratch: which species to grow, what equipment to use, where to grow, how to harvest. And at the time, we were literally starting a new sector in Scotland. And could we put my image up, please? Now we are ready to scale up after that prototyping work. And as we think about a new rural economy for Scotland, we do need to think blue as well as green. We're surrounded, after all, by water on 3 sides. Our land mass is absolutely limited, but the opportunities offshore are really significant. We now know that to produce 10,000 wet tons, we'll need 630 hectares or so. And that's equivalent to a mid-sized East Lothian arable farm. Our crop may well feed a shore-based hydrogen-powered biorefinery, producing bioplastics or compostable food packaging, or high-value nutritional supplements for cattle capable of suppressing methane by up to 90%. We now know that the UK dairy herd would require 30,000 wet tons to produce the necessary volume of supplements. So that needs 2,000 hectares. So how is this going to happen? The chief planner and his team need to get to work now. So my proposal number 1 is that Scotland needs a marine spatial planning system fit for purpose soon. So there is wakame growing off the west coast, and it's a phenomenal crop, Northeast Atlantic wakame. If we could take that image down, please. My second challenge is that knowledge and skill levels will determine the pace at which rural Scotland, from Shetland to the borders, can grasp the wide range of opportunities currently in front of us, some skillfully and attractively described by Magnus. In the face of the climate emergency, we need to rapidly accelerate research, teaching, learning, and application of knowledge around natural capital. Many high-quality jobs will be required, blending digital competence, science, carbon accounting, practical skills. We need leadership skills in spades. We need multidisciplinary polymaths for the 21st century. Recently, we took on a chap whose father had been a linesman in the North of Scotland Hydroelectricity Board. And this chap was taken on to look after 7 hydro schemes that we've built over the last 10 years in 3 remote glens in North Argyll. And this person is a graduate, a digital native. He can strip down and rebuild a generator. He can sit down with SSE's teams to discuss the 10-year grid strengthening plans. We need that kind of skill mix. We need to equip thousands of Scots to take up these roles. So my second proposal is that we need to create an enterprise university of natural capital in Scotland fast. And we do that by repurposing the old Scottish agricultural colleges, now known as SRUC. And this includes transforming the National Agricultural Advisory Service into a force required to lead Scotland's farming into an era of regenerative farming. So 2 clear proposals there. And with that, Deb, back to you.
Thanks, Dennis. Again, equally provocative, thank you. And 2 very clear proposals for us to consider moving forward. If I can invite now the second respondent, Neil Sutherland, please. So Neil, welcome. Neil is an award-winning, ecologically driven architect who runs his own construction company, Maca Limited, just south of Inverness. And he's actually, if I'm correct, a founding member of CEDA. So you're very particularly welcome. He's experienced in timber and land management and teaches at the Scots Sutherland School of Architecture in Aberdeen. So over to you, Neil.
Thanks very much, Deb, Magnus and Dennis. That was fabulous so far, so I hope I can make a suitable contribution. I'd like to discuss the related links really between repair on a landscape scale, future reindustrialisation based on wood, and how we might take forward new rural settlements into the future. And my belief is we need urgently to change the way away from single-use monocultural planning allocations and development. We need a movement towards mixed-use development comprising multiple functions, supporting new patterns of living and working. Large capital-intensive infrastructure is right now being replaced by minimal grid servicing options in many rural places. These can effectively deal with wastewater treatment, potable water, power, mobility, communications, etc. Could you put the first image up? You've had a taste of this already, actually. It's the kind of bright green one. So this is a smart clacking that Agnes referred to, something we've been working on recently. We could see this as a generic mixed-use settlement, workshops, terrace and detached houses, regenerative food and energy production, all within an expanding woodland context. We all need to live in a closer relationship with trees and woodland. Woodland expansion, including agroforestry, managed and less managed woodland, should be directly linked to all forms of development going forward, however large or small. The resulting economic uplift on land value could then replace state-funded woodland establishment. Planning policy would then be strategically and intrinsically supportive of the bioeconomy intervention. My first policy kind of issue, my only policy issue actually, is that Scotland needs an industrial policy for wood. Now, wood is the only significant renewable construction material, and right now we import far too much of it. From structural timber to insulation to board materials to joinery finishes, almost everything is imported, yet our homegrown materials, often suitable for high-end uses, remain underused. We need a roadmap matched with investment to sort out the supply chain for homegrown circular economy products. We have a climate and ecological crisis. We also have a housing crisis. In rural Highland, this is a crisis of quality and quantity. Our young folk can't access suitable houses, and we've failed them. The Scottish Ecological Design Association was set up around 30 years ago, as Deb mentioned, mainly by architects with a focus on the built environment, and I was there. Then it was about building biology, energy saving, and healthy materials. Since then, the focus has widened to embrace aspects such as whole life cycle carbon accounting, airtightness, advanced manufacture, carbon sequestration, etc. After 30 years, we know that the only viable, technically and financially viable, net zero approach to the built environment for renovation and new homes is a biogenic model. Concrete, plastic and steel-based models will not reach net zero. Many of us have been delivering timber, energy positive, carbon negative homes for years. Our movement can and has to become mainstream. The prize is health and well-being, landscape and biodiversity repair, skills and well-paid, meaningful work, and economic approaches, new economic approaches. Forget Silicon Valley, we need cellulose straths. The second image, please. So this is an image of Verin in Switzerland, a Swiss example of what I call a living landscape with many multiple functions: horticulture and agriculture, two chapels, farm and industrial buildings, houses, apartments, offices, managed and unmanaged woodland, transhumance cabins even. And can we imagine our mountainous places adding to the alpine places across Europe? So we've been advised to stay clear of the land ownership issue, but I'm going to briefly finish on a land use story. In 2003, my wife and I and our 3 young boys negotiated and purchased the purchase of 10 acres of a field west of Inverness. We now have a farm based on organic permaculture and agroforestry principles. We have 2 well-established businesses, one feeding 100 families in the area with seasonal organic veg plus restaurants and hotels when they're open, and the other manufacturing, designing, manufacturing and delivering up to 20 ecological homes per year. Together, these businesses employ 55 people directly. Both businesses are growing, and we're actually recruiting at the present moment. This land-based multifunctional model is European, completely normal in places like Switzerland, Austria and Scandinavia, but almost unknown here. Our 3 boys are now young men, having trained, studied, travelled and returned, all working in one of the 2 businesses, the family businesses, and that wasn't necessarily our plan. So onwards to better homes, regenerated places, and a revitalised economy. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Neil. I think if you look in the chat, you'll be seeing lots of positive comments about your contribution there, and it's really great to hear your own personal story as well. I think that adds another depth to the discussion. It's grand to see all the chat that's going on at the moment. Can I encourage everybody as well to keep putting questions into the Q&A section that we'll pick up in the 3rd part of this conversation. There's a few coming in, which is good to see, but please keep adding them there. We're just about to go into our first interlude, but before that, can I just ask for the 2nd poll question, please, on realising the potential of the Scottish rural economy. We've had quite a bit of provocation already, and I think this will hopefully set us up well for the panelists that are coming after the interlude. If you could please all sort of indicate which of the following options you think is the most important factor in releasing the potential of Scotland's rural economy, and we'll give you the results after the interlude. So in terms of the interlude, I'm delighted to introduce Sophie Cook. It's a live poetry reading from Sophie. Those of you that were at Conversation 3 might remember her from that, because it was a fantastic contribution that you made then, Sophie. And I think you're actually going to give us the world premiere of a reading of your poem Bread. So over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Deb. Hi, nice to be with everyone this afternoon. This is the first public outing of my new poem Bread, which I wrote for this. It's about our food. Bread. Your food unites you with the earth beneath you. Life's first formed, tiny, invisible creatures gather from rock and water and air what the rest of life is built on. They pass these on, these golden letters, in conversation with the roots of plants. Both are ears and tongues at once, taking, giving, the necessities of life and sugar made from sunlight, so that tiny life and plants can live. The goodness of the rock is useless if we do not have the sun. The brightness of the sun builds nothing if we do not have the soil, that dark box of talk. Soil is where light and darkness meet and create life. This is where words have their beginning. The golden letters of the earth, the sun's breath to speak them. They are in the wheat that waves in summer sunlight under skies of rain and wind. The whole of the world is in this grain of wheat, to be ground, mixed with water, livened by the heat of human hands that touches air's yeast to life. Your knuckles, palms, all they have known, are pressing the dough. The lines on your hands, threads to join the air and ground. Here is your food, bread, made by the words in your blood, baked to be eaten with others at a table out of doors, in a warm evening, with a plain white cloth on which shadows might intertwine. Thank you.
No, thank you. That was lovely, and it's just an amazingly strong reminder of how we're all connected to the land through our food. So thank you for that. And I understand actually we've all got access to that poem. As Gail says, it's in our goodie bag, but I think it just means we can actually I'm not quite sure what in our goodie bag means, but I think it means you can all get it. So thank you very much. The poll, I understand, is about to close. Does that mean we can get the results yet, Glow, or shall I go to the first? Oh, here we go. So these are the results from that poll, and actually the response which achieved the most ticks in terms of being the most important one was land reform, followed by climate emergency legislation, reformed local government, well-funded Scottish National Investment Bank, and then a few people obviously have some other ideas. So please share what you think the other ideas are in the chat or via a question. That would be excellent. And I'm pretty sure most of you will have wanted to tick all of those boxes, so apologies for forcing you into just one of those responses. But again, it's really interesting to frame the discussion from this point on. Thank you. So now I'd like to move into the second part of our conversation, which is where I introduce three panelists to get their perspective on a new vision for a rural economy. And the first person I'm going to introduce is Professor Ronald McDonald. Ron is a professor in macroeconomics and international finance in the Adam Smith Business School at the University of Glasgow. He's written extensively about the opportunities and the potential of policy actions of government to balance the health and well-being of populations. And I really look forward to hearing his take on the areas that he writes about, but specifically in relation to rural Scotland. So thank you. Over to you, Ron.
Yes, thanks very much, Deb. Thank you for that. I'm going to look at some of the more macro issues relating to how we rethink the rural economy. And my main argument is that given the pandemic is so closely associated with environmental degradation and climate change, I think we need to see the pandemic as a key inflection point for our society. If we are to address the kind of issues that we've been discussing in these conversations, we need radical change in response to this crisis, rather than trying to patch things up as we've done before in previous crises, for example, in terms of the financial crisis. And that will mean that we'll need to galvanize communities into taking action in these key issues. It also means the kind of development model that we've been using in the past will have to be thought through again. That model has been one in which there's been an over-reliance on financial capital at the expense of other capitals, such as natural capital and also social capital. I believe there'll be a definition of that on the chat for those of you not familiar with it. And this model has rent-seeking and short-termism at its heart, rather than sustainable productive investment. We need to move away from that model. In order to do that, I think we have to think of a model which has at its heart sustainable growth. That is growth that goes beyond simply looking at GDP. It refocuses on certainly GDP in itself, that's still going to be important, but also social and environmental aspects of sustainability. And as I said a moment ago, it's got to reposition away from an exclusive focus almost on financial capital towards these other important capitals, such as natural and social capital, which are in decreasing supply relative to financial capital at the moment. Now, at the heart of a sustainable growth model, I believe, will be that it's important for Scotland to have a natural capital target. That is to say, we need to think about how we maintain our renewable capital at the very least, or hopefully try to increase the level. And also we need some form of general capital compensation for the depletion of non-renewables. And there are various ways of doing this. I think at this time, as I said a moment ago, we really need a focus in our society to try and address these issues of climate change and the related inequalities that we see in our society today. And I think having this kind of target would be very important in that respect. We need to rebuild social capital in tandem with the preservation of natural capital. There's a huge amount of empirical evidence that shows that social capital and trust in a society can have lots of positive benefits, such as reducing inequalities, health in terms of both physical and mental health. And as Parth Dasgupta has noted in his path-breaking report on the economics of biodiversity, restoring the biosphere will ultimately depend on whether people are able to act collectively towards that goal. That would initially be through neighbourhoods and networks and communities, but on from then into the larger spheres of our community and civil society. Now, going into the pandemic, ONS and Scottish Government data showed that social capital along various measures was declining in Scotland and in the UK. Trust in government was going down. These were all significant changes. Other data shows that trust in corporations, which I'm going to touch on in a moment, has also reached rock bottom. Now, it's not clear entirely what effects the pandemic will have on social capital. I've written a short paper recently which suggests it may have improved social capital, but nonetheless, I think one key objective as we move out of the pandemic is that policymakers need to refocus on rebuilding social capital in terms of community networks, rebuilding the trust in institutions such as various layers of government, and also crucially the corporation. Now, the reason I've mentioned the corporation or the firm in this is that since the 1970s, the corporation's sole objective is the Friedmanite objective of maximizing share value. This has led to a huge short-termism in our economy, and indeed in other economies. It's compounded by the kind of share buyback schemes that this shareholder capitalism has induced. And this has led to dramatic income inequality. But also crucially in terms of our discussion here, it's meant that firms can ignore the effect that they have on natural and social capital. So I believe it's crucially important that in going ahead out of the pandemic that we move to some form of stakeholder model, loosely speaking, where the effects and the relatively scarce forms of capital can be recognized. They can't be in the current model. And this could come perhaps by redefining the firm's profits to take account of the depreciation of social and natural capital. We'd probably need to change corporate law to bring this about, but it's crucial, I think, that we do this, because if you look at other countries where they have stakeholder models, Japan, Italy, and Germany, you see a much higher degree of trust in these countries. And I think rebuilding trust, as I said, is going to be essential if people are to act collectively towards the common goal of addressing environmental change. The last comment I'd like to make in this regard and recommendation is with respect to the financialization of land that we've seen in the post-war period, and particularly the kind of boom and bust consumption economy that has created as well, with all of the wealth and income inequalities associated with that. And given that much of natural capital in the non-urban sector is a public good, I think we need to think seriously about what kind of taxes we need to ensure the maintenance of natural capital, what kind of subsidies we're currently using, are they the right ones to ensure the appropriate target for natural capital that we mentioned a few minutes ago. Now, land taxes, of course, are very controversial, but of course, also from an economic perspective, they are very efficient taxes. And so I would advocate that we need to rethink our taxation of land and also property. And indeed, the returns or revenue generated from these kind of taxes could be fed into some compensation mechanism in terms of the natural capital target that I mentioned a few minutes ago. Okay, so I've made a few controversial points there, so I better stop at that point.
No, that's perfect. We're keeping up this provocation, which is fantastic. I mentioned land taxes and you're bound to start the hairs running, but that's fantastic. Can I ask actually for another poll, please, specifically related to one of the points that Ronald made? And this is about whether Scotland should adopt a target for natural capital with some form of capital compensation for the further depletion of non-renewables. So this is a specific proposal that we should have this target rule that the Scottish Government has to maintain. And if you could just answer quickly, please, yes, no, or just you don't know, and we can carry on that discussion slightly later on. Thank you. We'll get the results of that poll, please, after the next panel member speaks. And I'm very pleased to introduce now Guy Watt. Guy is a managing director of John Clegg Consulting Limited. and he's co-chair of the Scottish Forest and Timber Technologies industry. He's well known in the forestry industry, and he's going to give us a few perspectives on what forestry can offer in terms of a vision for the new rural economy. So over to you, Guy, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Deb. That's very kind of you. I mean, there's lots of exciting ideas, and I'm very impressed. And I'm not sure my thoughts are going to be quite up to some of the other ones. But I think one of the ones that seems to be coming through is climate change. And you mentioned it, and others have mentioned it. And I think the one thing we haven't mentioned today is that we have net zero carbon emissions by 2045. Which is just 24 years away. And I did hear someone talking the other day about this, and they said if you do a little bit every year going up to 2045, it's not too bad. But the longer you leave doing anything about it, the steeper and more difficult it gets. And I think one of the questions is this just for the urban economies, or are we going to have to make changes in the rural areas? And what's that going to be? And we've touched on COVID, so that's an added challenge, I think. The other one is, and we haven't mentioned it, I don't think, is the report of the Independent Committee on Climate Change that identified more tree planting is an important way to help meet these challenging climate change targets. Now, talking about tree planting and trees, I think we probably got about 200 different images in people's minds here today as to what that means. Some will be very specific, but we've seen some lovely images of all sorts of trees in the course of these conversations. What I would like to say is we have a lot of different tree species. We can plant them at different distances, we can manage them in different ways, and we can harvest them in different ways. And I think we need them in both the rural and urban areas. And I think we have touched on ecosystem services, and I think trees can do that, and they have been doing that, but they can also help with recreation, and we've heard about health as well, and tourism, and they can bring jobs. So I see that as one way forward and a way to help meet our climate change targets. But I think with some of this, we quite often get involved with putting people in silos or learning about different aspects of land use in silos. We have farmers, we have foresters, we have ecologists, conservationists, but perhaps we ought to have rural land managers so we don't get stuck with that. Because I think one of the things that's often been talked about is integration of land use. And we kind of talk about it and have talked about it for many years, but we don't seem to do anything about it. And I think we need to look more carefully at how we use land. And there are some good examples where trees have been planted by farmers and it has helped the productivity of their farms. Back to climate change again, and I'm really going to pick up a point that Neil made about the importance of wood and wood products, as you might expect from someone who's been involved in the forest industry for all their working life. I think that one big thing as well is that these wood products are a store of carbon, and they can be there for 100 years or more, and they can be recycled. We're looking at the opportunity to recycle wood out of, or wood in buildings again in 100 years. So it's a renewable natural product, and we're getting around to a circular economy for Scotland. And I just reiterate the point that Neil made, that we produce about 40% of the sawn timber requirements we need. And so we have to import it. And we import 80% of our wood products. And of course, one of the things that comes to mind is the amount of cardboard we use, particularly with e-commerce. You have these boxes coming in all the time. We don't make cardboard in this country, but we do recycle it. And so my question is, do we just offshore all our requirements for wood products and continuing the way we want to use our land at the present time? And if we don't like this, do we just offshore it? I mean, in the case of wood products, there's a huge demand from China and America and in developing countries. So there's a lot of people recognize the importance of wood and wood products and are interested to get hold of it. So perhaps we need to use more of our rural land to produce more eco and climate friendly products rather than offshoring it. We've been asked to reimagine where we live and work, and I would like to suggest that Scotland's land is used to provide a source of plant material to bio-refine and make into biochemicals and bioproducts. For example, we tend to think of trees as a source of solid wood products on paper and paperboard, not as a source of chemicals and bioproducts. There's a company in Norway called Borregaard, which has produced 800 different chemicals from biorefining trees. And this particular company makes lignin-based products that are used in 16 different parts of the economy, ranging from agriculture to battery additives. And I'd also like to mention some very exciting research in Scandinavia, and particularly Finland. I don't know whether many of you know that trees have a defensive mechanism to protect them from pathogens, and that's in the bark of the tree. Now, what's happening in Finland is they've looked at the bark of a tree and decided that it contains the right chemicals to develop biocides, which are able to be used on surfaces such as in hospitals or anywhere where we need to be very careful about infections. So very relevant in this present day and age with COVID. And I think most of us get pretty fed up with plastic packaging and the use of it. And we know it's made from non-renewable resources. And what's happening now is in Finland, they're making a replacement product made from trees. And what does surprise me too, just recently I've heard they're making optical fibers out of trees. In other words, it's actually made, I think, out of nanocellulose. It's not as good as what you get in the roads outside when you watch your television or anything like that, and the communications we're having today. But it has been used in medical operations, and so they can see what is going on in the human body. I think probably a number of particularly women will be aware that metal mesh implants have caused a major problem for women. But a bio-based replacement product has now been successfully developed. And I think the exciting thing to me of these two examples is that they suggest that medical bioproducts made from trees are not rejected as seriously by the human body as they do for man-made products such as metal and plastics when they're put into our bodies. So that's a whole new area of medical research there. I'd also say that they've been making textiles, clothes out of products made from trees, from the cellulose fibers. And what is, I think the president of Finland's wife used a dress made from cellulose at one of the formal functions in Finland. So what excites me about this is if we can move this product production into commercial use and to make clothes from it, because not only does it save producing cotton in China, whereas we all know there are problems with Uyghurs and the huge amount of water used, but we've got a product that once we've used it, we can recycle and make into other products rather than burning it or doing something else. So should we therefore be using more land for growing trees or other cellulosic material? I have to say what I've been saying is about trees because that's what I know a bit more about than other cellulosic materials. But as we move away from using non-renewable natural sources, that must surely be one of the things that we need to look at. And what will happen to Scotland's food production? I guess some of you say if we expand the amount of cellulosic material we grow in Scotland. Well, vertical farms are starting up in urban areas, and I listened to a talk by one of those people quite recently, and it is getting underway. And work is going on at pace to develop plant-based alternatives to meat, dairy and eggs for climate change reasons and for health reasons. In 2019, £1 billion was spent on looking at these alternatives. And in 2020, there were 170 new companies set up worldwide, raising $3.1 billion to help them on their way. So I think things are moving in a pretty fast way. And I also, just before I finish, remember Mads Fischer-Muller in an earlier conversation pointing out that 3/4 of Scotland's agricultural land was used for animal production or producing food for animals. So maybe we need to be more imaginative in thinking about the future use of land in Scotland. And perhaps we should be aiming to use our land and countryside to help make Scotland a world-leading, sustainable, bio-based economy in recognition of the climate change issues we all face.
Thank you, Guy. Thanks. Plenty of food for thought there. I'm conscious that time's moving on, so I'm going to go straight to introduce our third panel member, please. That's Duncan. So Duncan Bryden will be well known to many of you in the audience as a rural development specialist in Scotland. He's previously been Vice Chairman of the National Parks UK, Chairman of the Cairngorms National Park Authority and Director of the Scottish Wildlife Trust. He has a particular interest in strategic policy and planning in rural and mountain areas, and I'm sure his contribution here will touch on those aspects. So Duncan, over to you.
Thanks, Debs, and good afternoon, everybody. I wanted to sort of cover some of this concept of reimagining both in the short term and in the longer term. I guess the short term is really about the pandemic that we are still in and are likely to be in for a while. This has had a major impact on travel and tourism, as most people will know. The hospitality sector and the tourism sector have been hit particularly hard, and Scotland is no exception. We've lost all our international travellers, which bring massive export benefits to Scotland. It's disrupted supply chains. And I think probably we've actually seen quite a loss of trust in government and institutions, which I may come on to later on. But what we are seeing as we hopefully move out of the pandemic is this major interest in nature and the countryside and the environment. Apparently TripAdvisor reporting a 40% increase in searches for nature-based destinations. And there's been this huge shift towards quality, provenance, health, and obviously from a growth in the domestic market as well. So it'll be interesting to see how this is played out in rural Scotland, because in the Highlands and the islands, tourism is a major part of the economy. In places like Ross-shire, it constitutes 35% of the economy. It's much less possibly in areas like the Borders and Dumfries and Galloway, which haven't really been mentioned today. But I can see them moving much more into a tourism arena. They're much nearer the bigger markets of England, of our domestic colleagues over the border there who are going to flock north, and I suspect some of the first areas they're going to come to are going to be quite attractive to them. So Dumfries and Galloway and the Borders will see an increase. So these are the sorts of factors that are going to happen, I think, in the short term, and tourism is going to be a really important part of the reset of the whole economy, which probably isn't going to pick up, perhaps until 2025. So there's going to be quite a gulf to make up back to the levels that we experienced in 2029. Looking longer term, I think there's going to be a big move towards resetting tourism. And there was some thought of this before the pandemic. It was very much the case that people had begun to realize that the previous volume and value model was really not delivering the benefits to place and to community that tourism could be delivering. And we saw that with over-tourism and pressure that was building. And I think it was exacerbated by the pandemic, and we may yet see a bit more of that as people are released from lockdown. But figures like 5,500 Airbnb properties in the Highland area alone, that's 175% increase from 2017. We've talked about housing, but clearly people in the Highlands are switching to things like Airbnb and self-catering, and we're going to see a big trend in that area, and that puts more and more pressure on the local communities and housing in particular. So moving on in terms of what we really need to address, I think it's areas like productivity and leakage. A lot of tourism benefit does leak out of the economy, and it's quite a low productivity sector, much lower than many of the others. We've heard about aquaculture, we've heard about forestry, we've heard about construction, and tourism is unfortunately languishing a bit at the bottom of the pile there. But it's a very easy entry product, and there's lots of young people getting into it, and it creates multiple small businesses. So it has huge potential value if we can make it as part of a diverse economic approach. And it's really not healthy for places like Ross-shire to have 35% of their economy tied up in tourism. That's not healthy at all. The average, I think, in Scotland is about 8%, which is possibly more an appropriate level. So wrapping this up over to the long term, we've touched on many of these things already in the talk this afternoon, but clearly integration, I think, is really important. We need to develop a systems thinking for tourism, just as many of the other sectors. And we need to look at sort of net impacts. You look at somewhere like the North Coast 500, the economists and others will tell you it's generated 30 odd million to the economy, but what perhaps they haven't accounted for is the impacts on the natural capital, on the communities, on everybody's daily lives, on house prices, all these sorts of things. So we need to look at a much more rounded product. And finally, I think moving forward, we need leadership. This is a crucial element in many of these sectors. We need younger people, the new millennials, the Generation Z, to step up in terms of leadership. They may need some training and some guidance, but moving forward, leadership, I think, is going to be absolutely crucial, with multi-skills to take us forward into the new parts of the millennium. Thank you.
Thanks, Duncan, and thanks particularly for picking up on a few areas that haven't come up yet, like tourism and well, I guess leadership had a little bit in terms of training, but thank you very much. I think that's given us a really well-rounded perspective on issues. We've got a few more minutes left in this section. Can I ask for the results, please, of the poll about natural capital, please? So I'm aware that this poll has created quite a lot of chat, and just giving Ron a bit of a pre-warning here that I'm going to go to him in a moment to address some of the issues that have come up. But just in response to the question as framed, 63%, a quite significant majority, agreed with the proposition. 9% said no, and 28% said they don't know. So strong support for the proposition. But there were some comments in the chat, Ron, which I'd like to ask you about. And in fact, I invite all of the panelists to put their video on, please, so that I can maybe pick up, or if they want to come in on any of the issues, that'd be grand. So Ron, some of the comments that were coming through were obviously implicit in that question was an issue about valuing natural capital. And some people have concerns about that, and to get your perspective on that would be interesting. Interestingly, 1 or 2 people felt that there should be an increase in natural capital, not just maintaining it. And then there is just an issue about broader or alternative perspectives, mainstream economics perspectives on the value of the natural capital. So just over to you for a few comments just on what's coming through the chat, please.
Yeah, I mean, I recognise the issues that people are referring to there with respect to valuation, but I think it is crucially important, coming from where we've been, where we haven't tried to value capital, and therefore, how do we know what we're going to pass on, as it were, to the next generation in terms of a sustainable model and outcome? So I think a starting point, which obviously the ONS are already doing, is we must have some kind of register of natural capital, which is at least as important as the existing items on our national accounts, because otherwise I believe we'll continue to make the same kind of mistakes that we made in the past. So I think that'd be my response to that. The second point you made, Deborah, was in terms of natural capital. I've forgotten what the second point was.
Yeah, it was about, there was one comment which I found really interesting, was about we shouldn't just be maintaining it, we should be increasing natural capital.
Yeah,
Yes, your views on that would be good.
Yeah, so I mean, I did say that I think the baseline should be at least to keep it constant, and I would certainly favour starting to restore natural capital. It's certainly, given the damage to biodiversity that we've talked about in previous sessions and indeed in this session, I think that is going to be crucially important going forward.
Okay, thank you. I was also going to pick up, I feel like I'm cheating a little bit because I'm not supposed to be the one asking all the questions, but a few of your contributions made me think a little bit about the recent experience we've had with COVID. And if any of you would like to jump in on the extent to which you think that offers opportunities in terms of what you were talking about. I'm thinking particularly in terms, I guess, of tourism or perhaps and housing related issues. So any thoughts on that?
I think if I may come in on the tourism, to a certain extent, what I said earlier still holds true, obviously. I think there's been a revaluing, and I notice on the chat there's quite a lot of talk about, you know, the economic value of natural capital versus the value in however you choose to describe that. But open spaces, biodiversity are now being shown to have an immense value for leisure, recreation, mental health, morale, call it what you will, social well-being. And I do think we need to try and capture that in some sort of way. And I think, again, what is shown is that the pandemic has exposed our lack of investment in rural infrastructure. You can't run a world-beating 21st century tourism industry if you can't keep your toilets open. You know, I mean, it's sort of fundamentally basic stuff. And if you're running an attraction or a factory, you would have your percentage of your turnover would be allocated to management and maintenance. It's normally somewhere between 2 and 4%, something like that. And when you look at how much tourism, for example, generates for the economy, and if you took between, say, 4% and reinvest it in the basic facilities, we would have a pretty good service, but we don't. It's hived off to various other places to support other things. And we really need to reclaim that, and particularly rural community need to reclaim that investment and get it spent locally.
Thanks, Duncan. I've got Neil and Magnus, and then we'll have to move to the next interlude. So just quick responses from Neil and Magnus, please.
Sure, thanks very much, Deb. Yeah, housing and COVID, housing and housing crisis. Haven't we all thought about how important it is, the environment in which we live, the ability to do multiple things in it, you know, educate, work. Many of us in rural areas have been so much better off in that respect. The kind of sadness of this is that ever since I was a student, which isn't yesterday, we've been talking about this crisis of housing, and it's just not being addressed. And I think that what's going to happen really is when this becomes a priority relating to all the issues we've been talking about all together. So it's a kind of systems thinking approach to this, and particularly in relation to skills and employment and these tangible economic issues. I mean, you know, just today we got the papers through for an apprentice. And he's going to be with us for 4 years. It's a dual commitment, when that young lad comes out, we've got young women as well, by the way, which we should have more of. He's going to be on a wage of 25 to 30,000 pounds. You know, these high-skilled, well-paid young people. You know, and you contrast that to a graduate, you know, that can't get a job. You know, I mean, we should be building houses in rural Scotland from the products and with the people. That's what we need to do. We need houses, we've got materials, we need skills. Put it all together and we have a solution.
Thanks. And Magnus, just briefly, please.
Yeah, very quickly, I'll add on to Neil. We need to be building houses. We need to be putting land into the control of communities so they actually have land to be able to build houses, and we need to be able to give those communities access to capital, which is quite difficult at the moment.
Great. No, thanks, Magnus. So thank you to all of the panelists. Just to remind the audience that what we're trying to do through these conversations is come up with some actual practical recommendations that we're going to put in a report and send to Scottish Government. So that's the aim of the conversations. And so if you can frame your questions in relation to that. I've seen lots of questions coming in, which is excellent. Over the next interlude, the backroom will compile these. And so please stay with us as we enter our third stage, which is the question and answer session. The next interlude I'm delighted to introduce is a film. It's a film called Remandering by Jules Horn. Now, Jules made this film as part of the Working the Tweed project for the Year of Natural Scotland. And it's about a canalised, is that how that doesn't sound right, canalised, it's a canal section that was re-meandered at Edelston near Peebles. So it's a beautiful film, so please sit back and enjoy.
We do have evidence here that a new road was put in, a straight road, as a toll road in 1790. And that's why the meanders were cut off the river.
Whereas over behind us, the high banks, the straight line, the river couldn't change in. It was just throttling down from high end to low end as quick as it could. You can do a fair amount of soil moving in a day with a machine this size.
We're trying to make it as natural as possible, so we've got the cross-sectional profile is as it should be, but we also need the right shape, so enough wiggles in it. But the other thing we need is the gravels and some of the vegetation, so we're actually transferring quite a lot of gravel into strategic points to create riffles and gravel shoals.
A stream isn't a uniform layer of water, and it has these different types of water. And the most obvious one is what we call riffles, where the water is actually breaking the surface. And those are very, very good because you get a high degree of oxygenation there.
You've got pockets of peaty type material, grey, silty, sandy material, which does go into pockets of clay.
And we're transferring some of the water crowfoot, which is the main water weed in the river. So that will provide instant habitat for these fish. But over time, after one or two floods, the gravel will redistribute itself and it will naturalise very quickly actually.
There's riffles, there's bars, there's deep areas on the outside of bends, which the river would naturally create. So the river will decide to redesign some parts, but the basis of the thing is to recreate something that naturally would be made anyway.
Then we're actually going to plant up the river banks with trees too, with native trees like willows and alder. Not solid trees, we want some dappled shade for the trout over the big pools that we'll be creating.
Re-meandering. Edelston Witter, 2013. I've been straight for 200 years, and now you want us to bend, meander, gone for a donder, curve a boot, drag my thick crow foot, my troot, my life, to yonder clay grave. I like it here, cool tight, my stain was, my striped jacket, my gun barrel sights, doon on Peebles tune, weaponised rain. You're fair clever, with your digger, your lidar, but I've power too. I can dig, I can lift, I can scour, scrape, shift, hills, rocks, hymns. Gies time. Our there's cauld and bare, nae air for fish, nae shaddies, life. You and your starter pack, an armful of ranunculus, hinging with snails, a bucket that rescued baggies and eels, a tipping o' gravel and caddis fly. Gain it a fair go. But natural? No.
If we start talking about restoring rivers, restoring landscapes, restoring cities, or any of those, one of the first questions is restore to what? I mean, if you want to restore this valley completely, 8,000 years ago it was a glacial dammed lake. Prior to that it was no doubt a wonderful wetland, a wooded wetland with no doubt bears and all sorts of things. And we're not suggesting that.
The digger's done its job. It's stirred a memory. My lost course, my lost way, my forgotten meanders, my riffles, my pools, my dapples, my donders, my side-winding sinuosity. A mind new. A bear dipped its paw here and scooped a fish out my midst and into its moo.
Many thanks to Jules for that film, which was extremely thought-provoking on the ways in which we can work with nature. I've got a lot of questions, so thanks very much for the audience, and I hope the speakers and the panelists are ready for this. I've been charged to try and get through as many as possible, so if we can try and keep the responses as brief, that will allow me to do that a little bit easier. But they are really interesting questions and they deserve some attention. I'll direct the questions to one of you, but please do indicate if you'd like to come in on each occasion, because this is supposed to be a conversation and I'd really like it to go that way if possible. So the first question, which I'm going to direct towards, oops, I've opened the wrong thing, sorry. First question, which I'm going to direct towards Magnus actually, is in relation to energy. So you talked about reindustrialization as one of your 3 R's. And many of the audience actually wrote questions about this. And the one I'm going to read out is from Joe Cumming, who says it's really encouraging to see Scotland creating so much renewable energy. But there seems to be a lack of strategic thinking about where wind farms and the connections to the grid are located. And the result is the destruction of some wild areas. So how can we help the government to think more strategically? So Magnus, if you could give us your thoughts on that in the first instance.
Excellent question. And again, to keep it very, very brief, you need to go where the resource is. So when you're decentralizing the energy system, you need to go where it's windy, you need to go where it's sunny. So that offers some challenges rather than just whacking a great big nuclear or coal plant next to every big city. We have seen some, and I would agree with much of the sentiment of the question, but we have seen measures put in place. We have landscape designations, we have SNH or Nature Scots 2014 map, and we're fortunately going to see a lot more generation shift offshore, but very quickly we're only it's only around 25% of our final energy consumption that comes from renewable sources, so we are going to have to build more renewable energy, and it might well impact on wildland areas.
Okay, thank you. I think there have been some comments relating to hydrogen production in particular. To what extent do you think this has the potential for revitalising the Scottish rural economy? Any thoughts on that from the panel?
Deb, if I could come in there, I think it's inevitable. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but I think within the next decade we will see hydrogen. We're seeing the work being done on the ferries at the moment, and the vision there to have those powered. I think processing onshore processing operations, such as the seaweed one I mentioned, should be powered. So they're going to be energy requiring, and they should be hydrogen powered. That's the way we should be planning and thinking about those. I think it's just a question of when, not if.
Okay, thanks, Dennis. Ron, you want to come in on this one too?
Yes, I've done some work in this area as well, and I think it's very interesting that hydrogen and ammonia also allow us to store renewable energy when the wind isn't blowing or when the tide wasn't powerful enough, and so it brings a new dimension to remote communities where they can, commodify renewable energy. Basically, they could actually trade in it. As Dennis said, they could use that energy to produce a whole range of things, for example, from seaweed in a sustainable way. And so we could bring about the kind of revolution that Magnus has referred to. And it's especially so in a Scottish context, obviously. And again, Magnus picks up on this point, given the huge renewable energy resource that we have out there. I think hydrogen is the fuel of the future, and I think it's very important that we as an economy and a society take a leading role in that, so that we're at the cutting edge rather than the end of the development where you can only pick up the low-hanging fruit, as it were.
Okay, thank you. My next question I'm going to pick out is in relation to housing. And I'm going to put this one to you, Duncan, in the first instance, just to give you a heads up. So COVID-19 has caused a surge in demand for rural houses, pushing up prices. And many of the purchasers are actually economically inactive. Now, this will have a negative impact on the demographics of rural economies. So what can be done to stem this? And that question was from Helen Houston.
Yeah, hi Helen. I entirely agree. I think it's a major problem. I think increasingly perhaps this is a government issue about which has been tackled to a certain extent because it's been put to local authorities to give them powers to manage change of use planning permissions and things for properties, and I can see that being brought in quite quickly. The converse, of course, is that these people tend to come with quite a lot of disposable income in pensions and what have you, which they spend on local tradesmen and that sort of thing to do up the houses. So there's actually a big economy there as well. So you have to be slightly careful what you wish for. But overall, I think there needs to be some more control on how properties can be transferred into the tourism sector.
So if this wasn't tourism, if these weren't tourists, though, they were effectively incomers, but a type of incomer that you might think is less helpful in terms of stimulating the rural economy than a working age household, what possible constraints can be put in that context?
Again, that's hugely difficult, short of building more houses, and I think there is a need, and all the others have touched on it in various ways, of allocating more land for genuine affordable houses that is in community control, so they can set up local allocations policies. They can ensure that key workers and people who've been born and brought up in the place have a good chance and aren't saddled with a massive mortgage or just an impossible competitive situation where they just don't earn enough, because the gap between when we all bought houses probably 20 years ago, your house was about 3 times your salary or your mortgage, but now it's sort of a factor of 10, I think. So people can't even get a deposit down, never mind buy a house. So we really need to address that, absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks, Duncan. Neil, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, just to make the kind of obvious point that the volume built housing allocations are a specific business model, which has got very little to do with housing. It's got everything to do with increasing the value of land. And what happens is the allocations, some of these companies are sitting on thousands of houses. They bring them forward when it suits them, when the market's heated up enough. The planning system is not agile enough, it's not being responsive enough to this situation, and it needs fundamental change. And I hope there's some planners on the call today. And I don't want to make myself unpopular with planners, but the fact is that I'm tired of this. It's been going on for years and years. And the UK has this bizarre planning system which effectively doesn't work in the community's best interest. We need smaller scale allocations so that communities and smaller entities can get hold of land to build houses. We'll see innovative housing. The big guys don't do innovation. We have a broken system and it needs fundamental change.
Okay, thanks, Neil. I'm going to stay with you because there's another question which is slightly linked to that from James Ogilvie, who asks you specifically, actually, is anyone lobbying for a legislative requirement for new housing to be carbon neutral or negative? Would this be a game changer for the timber construction sector? So if you could address that first, then maybe I'll go to Guy on that one.
Yeah, well, it's the same answer as Dennis gave to the hydrogen issue. It will happen. It's not happening quick enough. There are some things happening around the fringes with government. So we're involved in quite a number of initiatives with universities and whatever, but this is not mainstream yet. It's tinkering with things rather than, the big volume guys are lobby. They have a big powerful lobby, and they're gonna resist this change. But inevitably, within the next 10 years, we're going to see fundamental shift in this area. We've got to believe that. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. And Guy.
Yes, well, Neil's something of a pioneer in all this kind of work and is leading very much on this thing. But I think the other thing that's happening now is I think there's quite a lot of work going on with government to start looking at fabric first. And I think there are some policy changes in the wind coming, which may help in that and force people to think more carefully about the fabric of the building before it starts. But as Neil said, it's a big challenge. There are some big players in the game, and they have a business model which works for them. So it's going to involve a lot of hard work and re-education on their part. But I think the one thing that may start to change this is that a lot of the way buildings are built at the present time involve a lot of people and on site, and some of those skills have disappeared back to Poland and to various other Eastern European countries. So there is much more of an opportunity now, I think, to move towards looking at how we can minimize the energy profile of buildings.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to shift topic. I think this is a great question, which any of the panelists are very welcome to answer. I don't know who I'm going to go to first. I'll go to Magnus first, just going around the table. So this one is from Donald McPhillamy, and he says, apart from renewable energy, electricity and broadband connection, what other game-changing essential ingredients are there for a joined-up rural economy? And what I really like about that is this idea of breaking down silos, revitalizing a rural economy and joining it up. So Magnus, what do you reckon would be game-changing in that respect?
Young people, young families. The population's aging, the population in many areas is going down. Caithness, for example, is due to lose 20% of her population over the next 20 years. Sutherland due to lose 12% of the population. That's just due to an aging population. We need more young people, we need more young families.
So it's your repeopling, sorry. I really like that term, by the way, repeopling. Dennis, do you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, I would. We haven't really touched on it much at all this afternoon, but the whole question of local government, and I think that particularly Highland region is a difficult, unwieldy, remote entity for, I think, a lot of people living in the area. And I think along with those elements of infrastructure mentioned in the question, reform, and we've got some great models. I've spent time working in Scandinavia, as I'm sure a lot of people in this meeting have, and you just see a very different, much closer to the community decision making and accountability model. And so I would add that to the two forms of infrastructure mentioned in the question.
Okay, thank you. I've got another quite general question here, which is about how would the panel what do the panel think is the best way of increasing the diversity in rural areas? And I think by this they mean the economic diversity of rural areas, but perhaps other things. Diversity in rural businesses is so limited. This is from James Erskine. So any ideas about diversifying? Duncan, you've talked a little bit about tourism in that respect. Is there any other suggestions you might make in terms of how that could be done?
Well, absolutely. I think it follows on from what Dennis was saying about devolution down to community levels, and rather than have big centralized, economic development agencies, I would be giving money to small community development companies of varying sorts and saying, look, here's your money. We'll fix the roads and the broadband, but the rest of it's up to you. Some will work. There'll always be mistakes, but people will take ownership. People will find solutions rather than being imposed on them from above. And I think that's a much more healthy position, because people will have then responsibility. I think we've fallen into this trap of the council will do it because we pay our council taxes, but that's just not an option in the future.
Okay, thanks. Anybody else want to come in on that one about diversifying the economy? Ron, in the first instance.
Yeah, I think it is very important, clearly, given, as Duncan said, the huge effect the pandemic's had on tourism in certain areas. I know that myself in Skye, that the local economy has been devastated. So the diversification is very important. I think one of the ways is to exploit, as I said earlier, renewable energy. We could imagine small eco-friendly industrial parks related to crofting, if they've got access to clean energy, for example. We also know that people can live and work remotely. That's been one of the big changes during the pandemic, and that's likely to last. And so we've got fantastically attractive countryside here for people to come and live in and enjoy the open spaces, but also be able to work and connect with their business wherever that may be. The other thing I think I would mention on that is that, and it relates to your previous questioner, that we should be thinking about the health infrastructure in rural areas, because the whole equity of provision of healthcare is very difficult in remote rural areas because the distance you have to go to a general hospital. Now, the application of e-health, for example, during the pandemic is going to continue. And I think that if it is applied in rural areas, could attract a lot more people into these areas if they know they're going to get treatment which is comparable to, say, what they can get in an urban settlement.
Interesting point. Thanks, Ron. Neil, did you want to come in?
Yeah, if you look at the real dynamic examples in Scotland just now, they are community-led examples. So if you look at, all of the ones we know about, Egg, Knoydart, the Northwest, the islands, it's obvious when people have control, they start to make things better for themselves. And we're now seeing a number of landowners coming up with similar ideas, and they've got the drive, sometimes the investment and the good ideas to drive this forward as well. This is it's going to be a test for our systems. We're going to have to challenge some of the things that don't work, including the planning system, but we need to think about what is in the community's interest, and we need to have some confidence in our democratic processes. We need to change that as well. I'd agree with what's been said, but it is what we have at the moment, but we can still make it work to improve things. And we need to get on with it. Yeah.
Thanks, Neil. I've got a question here which I'm going to direct to you, Guy, in the first instance. Again, the other panelists are welcome to come in, but it relates specifically to forestry, and you've mentioned lots and lots of different ideas that forestry might play in a new revisioned Scottish rural economy. And the question's from John Mercer, who says, well, what should forestry look like in rural Scotland in terms of species mixes and falling regimes going forward? interesting question. Given the breadth of the suggestions that you were making in terms of the role that forestry should play. So what should our forests look like?
Well, I think it should overall be a diverse one. I mean, I can imagine plenty of people are saying, well, what perhaps I've said means endless rows of conifers. But I mean, there are areas where it can be, because big areas of conifers are perfectly acceptable. They aren't seen from a landscape point of view, they don't impact. But there are plenty of other areas where you can have quite a range of species. We've got plenty of broadleaves, we've got plenty of conifers. I think the real challenge is deer and squirrels. And we've talked about rewilding, which is, and I think there are plenty of areas where rewilding should take place, but deer are around, and I think that's a real challenge for all of it. So it's a diverse area. The soils, you've got to match your trees to the soils. And I think if we go back in history, there was very much more care taken to matching the species to the soils. And I think perhaps when we look at farms, there are areas of farms which are being used for various agricultural uses, but maybe more appropriately in trees. Quite often, I think we don't have many areas of trees which are going back into agriculture. But I think one of the earlier conversations was about peat, and foresters were ploughing up areas of peat. Well, I think that is certainly changing, and new guidance has just come out in the last couple of weeks. But that's going to squeeze trees. If we're going to have any more trees, it's going to be a squeeze, because usually agricultural land has not been accepted for planting with trees. And now we've got a squeeze in the other direction where we've got to keep off peat land. And if we're going to do something for climate change, we're going to need to have some more tree planting on what might be deemed to be agricultural land.
Okay, thanks, Guy. Now, I'm very conscious of time, and there's a question which I want all of the panelists to have a chance to answer if possible. I'm going to start with you, Dennis, just to give you the heads up there. And it's from the Scottish Communities Climate Action Network, who point out that the poll that we put out suggested that land reform was the single most important thing that we could do to release the potential of rural Scotland. If this is the case, what changes do you think would be fair and proportionate?
I saw the question and the 10-year, I think a 10-year horizon. Yes, that was a really good way of looking at it. I think one of the things I would do is speed up the process of thinking that's underway where local communities, villages, small settlements are surrounded by estate land, and making real progress in speeding up the means of releasing land from those estates close to those communities, which ties in with the whole local housing piece, I think, and would accelerate the development of communities themselves deciding what kind of housing, how much, and where to build in their locality. And I think that is something that would make a really significant change quickly. I think it would be fair, there'd be a fairness to that whole approach. And it would also deal with this shortage of people piece in some parts of rural Scotland.
Thanks, Dennis. Magnus, it seems natural to go to you after that response.
Fantastic question again, and it would just take one short moment to recognise what 100 years of land reform has delivered, perhaps in terms of the concentration of land ownership, less so, but in terms of things like security of tenancy and access to land in terms of the 2003 Act. I think we need to take time to recognise that. But if it was down to me, what I really like is the idea of a public interest test. So whenever an estate might be sold, or whenever there's a planning application on an estate, it automatically triggers a public interest test that looks at the management of that estate against environmental, social and economic considerations. And if it fails, that could point to compulsory purchase.
Okay, thanks. I think that's in hand. So it'll be interesting to see what that actually leads to. Neil, do you want to come in?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, Dennis and Magnus have answered the question. I don't want to say the same stuff, but I think we need to be creative in making linkages in kind of new economic areas that we haven't done up till now. And Guy has said quite a lot about forestry, and you know, he's slightly shied. I know Guy very well. He's slightly shied away from that toxic issue of forestry and agriculture. Both these things have to change. You know, we cannot keep doing this agriculture that we do. Who was it said that, you know, 70% of the global warming potential of our agriculture is down to ruminants, you know, it's down to cattle and sheep and deer. And, you know, we have to do agriculture differently. The great thing is that we can introduce trees into some of that. Sounds radical. It's not in other parts of Europe, in other parts of the world. And we can produce fiber for all kinds of really useful things, including houses and clothes and all these kind of things. So making linkages that we haven't made before, to be a bit creative about how we use the resources available to us. Scotland is a fantastic place for growing stuff, you know. You know, we've got the rain, the climate's great. You know, we could do so much more. We need vision. I think Dennis, in one of the things he said, leadership. We need to train people to be leaders, to drive organizations and businesses forward that have the power to change things. This is possible, you know, we can do this.
Thank you very much. I'm aware that time's going on. We actually have one more poll for the audience, which sort of hopefully builds on the discussion that we've had. So if we could pick up the last poll, please. It's the future outlook. This is a little bit cheeky, but we just wanted to know, after this conversation, what you felt in terms of the future of rural Scotland. So how optimistic are you for the future of rural Scotland? If you could please answer that poll over the course of the next interlude, and I'll give you the results at the end. And I guess one of the reasons we put a poll up is because we don't want you to go away for this final artistic contribution. It's absolutely fantastic. It's by the Poosies, who are an all-female folk group, and it's all about repopulating and incomers, and I'm absolutely sure you'll really enjoy this, so please stay with us and I'll tell you a little bit more about the next conversations afterwards.
We were getting on the ferry boat in my mama's car when we passed by a stranger man. He was out of place but far. Me and my mama and my granny all stared at him standing on the pier. Then my granny leaned on the back of the seat and whispered in my ear, that man comes from a different island. His tongue is different, his eyes are different, never seen the likes of him. He could be that one for you, my dear. We're needing some new fresh blood round here. Fresh blood, fresh blood. We're needing some new fresh blood round here. Oh, Granny, will you stay out of my love life? I don't need your old advice. Just look at him. He's pretty queer, he'd have a hard time biding round here. Where would he work and what would he do? Would he ken what to do with a coup? And think on that bairn that would come for us, with its funny skin and its strange wee puss. That man comes from a different island. His tongue is different, his eyes are different, never seen the likes of him. He could be that one for you, my dear. We're needing some new fresh blood round here. Fresh blood, fresh blood. We're needing some new fresh blood round here. Fresh blood, fresh blood. We're needing some new fresh blood round here.
my brother Bill. I was staring into her squint eyes. She's got the same problem as me, and I was wondering about me web toes and if they run in the family tree. That man comes from a different island. His tongue is different, his eyes are different. Never seen the likes of him. He could be that one for you, my dear. We're needing some new fresh blood round here. He could be that one for you, my dear. We need new fresh blood here. Fresh blood, fresh blood. Needing some new fresh blood round here. Fresh blood, fresh blood. Needing some new fresh blood round here. Fresh blood, fresh blood.
So how great was that? And what a great way to finish the conversation. Could I have the results from the last poll? Is that possible? Just to see how optimistic we are. So we're mildly optimistic, 57% mildly optimistic. I guess that's not a bad result. 18% extremely optimistic. So thank you very much for your contributions. What I want to do now is just finish off the session by saying that concludes the 5th conversation, and thank you to everyone who's participated. First of all, our panelists, Magnus Davidson, Neil Sutherland, Dennis Overton, Ronald MacDonald, Guy Watt and Duncan Bryden. Many thanks indeed to all of you. All of the contributing artists, Kirsty Law, Sophie Cook, Jules Horn and the Poosies, and everyone that contributed a question today. We'd also like to thank our partners in organising and promoting these events. That's the James Hutton Institute, the Open University, Bella Caledonia, and the generous support of our sponsors, the Pebble Trust, and Wildland Limited. Now, unfortunately, we've not been able to discuss all of the questions that came up. You were fantastic in terms of putting forward questions, and we're pretty sure, well, I'm sure that many of you might want to raise further issues. So a Padlet document has been set up that you can access now to contribute your ideas, and you can find it at the address on this screen. It will also be available on the CEDA webpage for this event, and it will be open for 1 week for contributions. And it's the ideas that have come forward in this conversation and that are contributed to the Padlet that will be used to form a report that will be written after the last conversation. So please do contribute and have your say in the future vision for the rural economy. And we hope to hold events discussing these conclusions later in the year and hopefully at COP26. So the next conversation will be at the same time, but in 2 weeks' time after the Easter break. So at 4 p.m. on Monday, the 12th of April. And that conversation will be titled A Story for the Future. And it will be co-hosted by Chris Dalgleish of the Institute of Heritage and Sustainable Human Development and by Mary McFadden of Northlight. And it's going to consider art and community, and hard facts alone won't win the argument. So if you don't already have tickets, you can find out more about the speakers and hopefully buy tickets for this through the CEDA webpage at the link on the screen, where you can also find out more about CEDA. Finally, many thanks to everyone that's bought a ticket and watched, everyone that contributed to the chat. It's gone much faster than I thought it was going to go. It's been a fantastic conversation. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have, and that you've come away with some new ideas. And I hope to see you at the next conversation. Thank you.